Hey guys, welcome to the Creative Block. I'm Vince Gonzalez. I've been excited about this conversation. I've been looking forward to it. Today we're here with Marissa Trew. Marissa is Director of Engagement at Blokhaus, a marketing company that specializes in emerging tech. She is a podcast and host of Glitchwire, a podcast and media platform on the conversation of transformative technologies. She built her name within the emerging tech space as a professional host, moderator, MC since 2016, and has hosted and led interviews at events South by Southwest, VidCon, NFT Paris, NFT New York, specializing in emerging tech, including Web3 and gaming. She's also responsible for curating and hosting all blockchain art-related conference programming at Art Basel. Marissa is also host of the podcast Just So We're Clear, that focuses on Asian womanhood, now in its 5th season. So basically, I just want to be you when I grow up.
I mean, it's quite the
That's
introduction.
super impressive.
I'm one of those people that really struggles with doing one thing at a time. So when you list it all out, it sounds quite mammoth. So I appreciate the very flattering introduction.
It's really great, and thank you for making the time to talk to me today, all the way from Singapore. I really appreciate you making the time. The time difference is a little significant, so I'm grateful. So let me ask you. This we're talking here because Blockhouse, you and your team put out this article basically about the state of the union of emerging tech, what was happening at the end of last year, what's going on now, and kind of looking at the horizon a little bit. And in I had, when you see the title, you have expectations of what this is going to be about. And one of the things that really thrilled me was the word human appeared 16 times in the article. And that really surprised me. And it was like super refreshing too. Was that intentional, or did that just happen as you started working on it?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for reading the report. It was a huge effort from our team side. And I think part of the answer to your question rests in the fact that the report itself was 100% human made. There wasn't even an ounce of ChatGPT in there. And all of the artwork, none of that is AI derived whatsoever. It's just the sheer power of our creative team. So I think that sort of answers your question a little bit. But the truth of the matter is that it was both. So we did start with this core premise of what we knew to be true, essentially, what our stance was on the human machine debate. But being technologists, we had to naturally be open to adapting our position in light of whatever evidence it was that we found. But as we researched all the different components of the report, and there are quite a few components, we had AI, Web3, spatial computing, we even spoke about virtual influencers a little bit. We just found that this human element was validated again and again and again. And I think what it really boiled down to, and it's something that I fundamentally believe, it's that in and amongst all of this rhetoric that machines are going to be taking over, people often forget that we do actually have fundamental agency and impact. And yes, what that might look like could change over time. But I don't think we shift from being the centerpiece of this universe. Like, we are very much the main characters in this equation. And so, I mean, on a side note, I don't think that necessarily corresponds to nature as well. I think there's a more complex interplay of relationships there. But as it relates to technology, I think the core idea that people need to remember is that orbits around us and not the other way around. So this report, I feel, was our way to reassert that agency and empower readers with this knowledge and this intel to be able to harness this tech and move with it rather than feel like they were being bulldozed by it.
Right, which is super easy to do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of the discourse that's taking place doesn't really help us because they often take really extreme views and they don't really
Yeah.
create these sort of pathways where people understand areas in which they're still free to maneuver and how they're able to use this as something to empower the work that they do rather than be replaced by it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the things that breaks my heart a lot when I have these conversations with people that sort of read headlines only, is that there's so much misinformation about what it is. And with a lot of the critics, I agree with a lot of what the critics say, but there's so much missing in their understanding of it, and it's not the complete picture. So it's a little disappointing.
Yeah, I think there's a dangerous relationship we have with headlines in particular. I think as people who generally scroll the internet for hours per day to obtain sources of information, people need to remember that a headline is designed to catch your eye, to bring you to the content. But if you stop at the headline, you often miss a lot of the nuance of the ideas that rest in the content. And I say this as a former journalist. It would frustrate me when people would read the title that I often didn't have editorial say over, only to
Wow.
assume what I had written in the article or the perspective that I had positioned in the piece that I wrote. And that is where critical thinking really takes place. And to neglect that is dangerous. And
Yeah.
there's definitely articles where, yes, the content of the piece definitely does correspond to the hype or the fear mongering or the catchphrasiness of whatever it is they're talking about. But there are a lot of very nuanced ideas out there, but it's going to take more time and effort than scrolling through a feed and just picking up the top notes.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the way you think. There's a strong consumer interest in what's going on. There's companies that are trying to create, a lot of products to meet that interest. And it's happening at at a rate that's shockingly fast. So what that probably means is that there's going to be a lot of product out there, some of it good, some of it bad. And are there was a mention in the article about a potential fatigue to exposure. So even something that good that comes out that might be really useful might get met with, oh, this is just another AI thing, get lost in it. Like, what do you think of that, and how we're going to deal with that?
I think it's important to remember here that while a lot of this technology is really shiny and it's new and it's exciting and it's interesting, human psychology isn't. There is a point at which our brains will shift our attention because there's just too much noise that we will habituate ourselves to it. So I think there are pros and cons to the fact that there will be fatigue as well as hype, as well as novelty. Like all of these pieces come together to still bring us forward. So for example, if we were to look at blockchain, there was this huge level of interest and hype around, what is this new technology? What does decentralization mean, both in tech and in leadership? What does crypto fundamentally represent? These were huge, thought-provoking questions that we hadn't addressed before. And so it was important to be able to have these discussions. But then what we saw, particularly over the last year, and it was a very difficult year for crypto, was that the industry was forced to mature. So this hype around this industry, all the tokenomics, the token drops, the NFT drops, all of it sort of fell to the background. And the industry got a lot quieter. And that actually enabled the technology itself to continue to advance. And then it fell to the background as more of this infrastructure layer, which was actually what it was supposed to be the entire time. And that led to attention shifting more towards the applications that were being built atop those chains. So people didn't have to burden themselves with understanding the difference in architecture between a Solana versus an Aptos. They could focus on the user and the community activity. And sure, there was a lot of fatigue around that as well, but I think it's a great way to highlight the way that when hype fades and when attention dies around a particular thing, it allows us to divert attention elsewhere to something else that's important. So while you think, oh, the blockchain hype is dead, it isn't. It's just adjusted its angle and its course and pointed out something else that's important for us to realize. But of course, like that being said, people still hype different technical components of the blockchain, right? We're entering this era of modularity where people are talking a lot more about specialized infrastructure as being seen as the way forward, but it's still quite esoteric. And I think it's important to remember again that that's okay. Like it's fine for these exciting developments to be relevant to a niche few, but to still have a broader impact elsewhere. We don't need everyone paying attention to the same thing all the time to create progress. AI, on the other hand, is slightly different. I think people are going to fatigue from this hype cycle. And again, attention is going to shift away from the mere fact that AI exists. I mean, it's existed for decades, but just not as advanced as its current iteration. And I think attention is similarly to blockchain is going to start being shifted to what it's being used for. So bringing it back to human psychology, it's fairly predictable when it comes down to how people initially respond to a breakthrough and how they behave around it as it becomes more ubiquitous and a bit more normalized. So to compare the two industries together, like while blockchain is arguably in its third or fourth wave, contemporary AI, or how we understand it today, is in its first when it comes to mainstream public awareness. And so, I mean, taking aside the fact that AI is an industry in and of itself, people's interests, I think, are going to move towards the diversity of the use cases and its impact that it's creating, for example, in medical diagnostics, in the same way that we are seeing the impact that blockchain technology is creating in the way we interact on the internet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. And it's funny because when I talk to the sort of the average Joe on the street, they think it's only a year old. They think it only just came out, last year, and even, people that are using Siri and things like that, aren't really acknowledging that that's kind of where it came from. So that's kind of there seems to be this constant disconnect, and I guess it will always exist. And, it's just part of the growth.
I mean, OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, was founded in 2015. And we've only really started talking about it since 2022. So it's important to realize all of this progress often happens in the back end, and mainstream awareness is the last step, not the first step.
Yeah.
So all of these discussions actually happen, all of these discussions actually happen a little bit later than people realize. They are not the first in the uptake. Like, you always have that person at the party goes, "Oh, I knew it before it was cool."
I like their first record.
Exactly, same principle.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's silly to assume that we've just woken up to this and it's all brand new and we have the ability to change things now. There's a lot that's already happened that we need to go back and understand in order to have meaningful discussion about how it's going to go forward.
This sort of rocked me a little bit as we're talking about AI. One of the statistics mentioned in it was that there were 15 billion, with a B, AI generated images in 2023, surpassing the total number of photographs taken in the last 150 years. Now, I started out as a photographer. I took a lot of pictures. Doesn't look like I can really compete here. But that's staggering, when you think about in that short amount of time, what that means and where that can go. I mean, it's almost like where it can go is something we can't even calculate.
I mean, yeah, it's absolutely exponential change. And I think a lot of people struggle to even fathom what 15 billion even looks like as a number.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. And it's clearly testament to the power of the tech itself. I mean, as for the quality of the images, I think that's naturally going to be variable at best. So I think quantity doesn't necessitate sophistication of the technology entirely. I've definitely seen my fair share of pretty sketchy looking AI images over time. And of course, it's going to get better and better and it's going to improve faster and faster. But I think it's important to remember that just because it can churn out volume doesn't mean it's overpowering us. But bringing this back to the core thesis of the report, namely that, the fundamentals still matter, humans still matter, I think it's going to take a human eye to determine what quality actually looks like if they were to have the time to scan 15 billion images. Whether it's a good or bad thing, principally speaking, I think is really subject to perception as well. For example, in my mind, that data should really serve as a catalyst to having more critical conversations about, how we regulate this sort of technology. For example, we need to start asking ourselves the questions around understanding intellectual property and ownership and online safety. I mean, we recently had the Taylor Swift AI deepfake scandal. And luckily, she's a person of influence who could probably make an impact on a legislative front because of the the horror of what she would have had to experience and like the violation and
Right.
online harassment that she's just dealt with. But
Right.
the challenge is, of course, how do you regulate something that's so fast moving, right? That is like the ultimate question. And it's the same similarly that applies to blockchain, but arguably different in that it's happening at a pace that I don't think anyone was necessarily prepared for. So on Glitchwire, which is the podcast that you mentioned that I host and produce through Blokhaus, I had the opportunity to interview Trevor Trainer. He's the CEO of Croesus Labs, but he was also a former US diplomat and had a really good perspective on the inner workings of regulation. And I really liked his take because it was so simple. It was regulate the intended use of the technology, not the technology itself. It enables
Wow.
regulars to be a little bit more proactive and rather than being historically reactive. And so it drives the conversation in, I think, a much more productive way. So I think regulation has a really tricky relationship with technology. I think it's often seen as a hindrance to progress. You know, I still think, though, that certain safeguards can go a really long way. It's positive to see that so many AI safety summits have taken place just in the last year and globally as well. And it demonstrates that at least these conversations are happening in real time and safeguards can be set up, even if simple, but at least they can be iterative versus trying to crack down on something that they've lost control of.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's funny, even when I talk to groups in blockchain, I mean there is a desire, within this tech community for regulation. The scary thing is that so many of the regulators aren't really understanding what it is, but are quick to have an opinion about it and quick to make a vote about it. So it's a weird environment to be in, but I guess we're flying the plane and building it at the same time. I mean, this is kind of where we are.
Yeah, I would definitely say I think that's actually a perfect metaphor. We're trying to build
Yeah.
the plane as we fly it. I think from my unique position of, being based out here in Singapore and in Asia generally, it's amazing to see the contrast between different regulatory approaches. I feel like from what I've understood in the States, there's almost this risk aversion to what this technology can do, and therefore the best way is to limit its progress. While out in Asia, there's a much more receptive adoption of these technologies and this recognition that, this is a fast moving train, and our best bet is to get on and then just start tinkering with the controls from the inside. And I think it allows the industry to continue to flourish without it getting out of hand.
And this is a good segue. In the piece, there's WAGMI. We're all going to make it. I thought that was super brilliant. I probably a novice in that conversation. It was the first time I've heard it. Loved it. When you hear that or you read that from people that are on your side of the fence, what do you think the hope is built into that statement?
So I also love this statement. It actually derives from the crypto community, and I frankly think it could transcend that. I think it could be used throughout life as just this
I hope
positive
so.
mantra. For me, it means that, in the end, everything will work out one way or another. I think when you pose that question to me, I kind of think about it in three ways, or it encourages people to do three basic things, which is to stay optimistic and celebrate every marker of progress, no matter the size, to persist through challenge, hold fast when things are tough, and also just band together in support of one another so that everyone can succeed. Because I think sometimes when times get tough, people get competitive or adversarial, and this phrase sort of says, no, we're all on the same side, we're all on one team. But on top of that, I think it's just this phrase is so playful at its core, but its impact can't be underestimated. This is a phrase that raised morale for communities of people who really dealt with the brunt or the sharp end of Web3's ups and downs. And I think people often forget, once again, that when we talk about this technology, it really just is other people at the end of all of this, either building it, using it, championing it, and support and encouragement goes a really long way. I actually think back to there was this interview with Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, where he was asked, if you could go back, what would you do differently? And he said, I would never start a company because everyone
Wow.
underestimates just the loneliness, the difficulty, the challenge that comes with trying to build something from scratch, trying to create something that's never been done before, where there's no rule book, there's no guidebook, there's no manual. And so this collectivism that we've experienced within the Web3 community said, okay, we may not know the answers, but we're going to try our hardest and we're going to make it. And I love that sentiment. It's so optimistic, and there's a purity to it that I think really carries communities forward.
That's fantastic. And the fact that you describe it as playful, I think, is really critical. It's a very human response.
Very.
So, the MetaQuest is out. Apple Vision Pro came out this month in February. We're having conversations about AR, VR, XR. I've always loved the conversation of AR. I always felt like, what's happening is what Apple intended, but the flavor of conversation that we're having, does this represent sort of our breakaway from our phones, from our desktops, from our tablets? Do you think that's where we're going with this?
Personally, in some ways, I do think so. I do think, though, that we have a really long road ahead before we see that taking shape. I mean, I don't think many people actually stop to think and to consider that the hardware we consider an essential in our everyday lives might not be with us forever in the form that it exists in now. Things change gradually, and then before we know it, our habits are entirely different, and we've adapted without even realizing it. I mean, I remember when I was a teenager, I couldn't fathom going anywhere without, my phone, my digital camera, my iPod Nano, my Tangled headphones, and my wallet with cash in it. And maybe a debit card if I was old enough to have opened a bank account and put $50 in it. And, a few years later, I rarely go out with anything other than my phone because I can do everything from a single device. My credit card is tapped into my phone. I don't need to bring my wallet anywhere anymore. So again, I think we're seeing this shift happen gradually, but I don't think we will wake up to it until it's completely different altogether. And so, when we're seeing these huge shifts in the advancements of AR, VR, XR, spatial computing, I think the Apple Vision Pro specifically is a core part of that. I think most of the reviews speak of how surprisingly sophisticated and how seamless this experience can actually feel. But, despite having to wear this giant pair of goggles on your face. So I think for now, we're still in the very early stages of testing out that the role that this tech is going to play in our day-to-day experience.
Yeah.
There definitely are some people who've chosen to leave the house with this giant pair of goggles on. But personally, I think the bigger paradigm shift here is how this is going to affect how we perceive and interpret our physical and our digital realities. It's less about what is this device we're going to start taking with us, and more about our relationship to what we consider our online and our offline lives. So I'd say, historically, we treated those as very distinct spaces. And now we have these immersive tools that completely blend the two together. And again, that blend is going to get increasingly more seamless. And I think spatial computing devices essentially just represent that bridge. So reconciling the realities on either side and how we change the way we interact as a result, I think we still have to navigate. I don't think we've answered those questions yet. But as I said, the hardware, super clunky in size. I think we will see them get smaller the same way that our phones did, and they will get more portable, potentially a lot more invisible. And when we start bringing it out of the house with us more regularly and more normally, that's when I'd say that transition away from the hardware we use today, that's when that would be complete.
Yeah.
Whether that's a world we want to live in, that's still very much up for debate. I think, where we're even more immersed in our devices and our digital lives is something that we also need to philosophically address.
Yeah, those questions, those things to consider are going to come racing forward really fast.
Yeah.
It's going to be kind of really bizarre. We're also seeing like major brands, Coca-Cola, Google, coming out with AI products. And, we're also watching them not all succeed necessarily. And in the future, we won't watch them all succeed. You know, Back in the day, there was a mad rush, for NFTs. Everybody was coming out. And all the major brands were also like trying to jump on board this sort of digital food, fashion, lifestyle, all kinds of industries you wouldn't imagine that they were going to jump on board with this. But a lot of those did not seem to have successful swings at it and are still struggling to figure out where they belong in it. But AI, it's not fair to say that's exactly what's happening to AI because it's kind of fundamentally different as to how people use it.
To kind of address each blockchain and AI, because I think while there are parallels, there are also distinct differences as well. I think we're seeing a combination of approaches. I think there's the what I like to call the spaghetti approach, which is you throw everything at the wall and you see what sticks. And we saw that across both Web3 and AI. Essentially, as you just mentioned, brands just diving right into the chaos, no matter what, no real thought about what the long game of their engagement with this technology was going to be. They just didn't want to miss out and they wanted to see what it would mean to participate. And, in Web3, we saw that result in a lot of backlash because brands really hadn't through their value proposition or they never really asked themselves why they were getting involved. I always think back to when Porsche launched its NFT and it completely bombed. And when you read the sentiment online, it was largely because people were saying they just didn't understand the psyche of the Web3 community they were trying to interact with. And my favorite comment was, I think I'd rather just buy the car. So there was this disconnect that was happening.
Yeah.
And these were
Yeah.
questions that marketers really should have taken the time to think about before they rushed in. I think reactive marketing has a role, but it can be dangerous when you are making such a big leap into something that you just don't fundamentally understand. The contrast
Yeah.
to that being said, is the more deliberate and the foundational approach. So brands understand the value they can derive from Web3 and also the value that they can offer in return. That reciprocation is absolutely fundamental. So I personally think one of the best examples was Adidas launched its Three Stripes studio. I had the opportunity to interview Erica Wicks-Sneed at NFT Paris last year, and she spoke about how they developed the Alts NFT program and how they used it to cultivate customer loyalty by having a very clear value proposition. They incentivize continued engagement because you would have to actively burn one NFT to unlock the next level. So there was always this need for you to pay attention to what was happening. There was exclusive merchandise that was available offline, like physical merchandise, and then major partnerships with Web3 communities like the Bored Ape Yacht Club. So again, that's the perfect microcosm to demonstrate, you had this cultivated community across Web3 natives and True Blue Adidas fans. You created tangible value and you introduced novel dynamics. So again, they developed the Three Stripes Studio well ahead of them actually entering the market with this product. And that slow burn meant that they could pick up their pace the moment they were in the arena, while others that started with a dead sprint lost their energy very fast. On the other side of that, and we look at AI, I think it was a little bit different. We did see a lot of brands rush in, but I think they faced less immediate backlash. And I think that might just have been because there was simply less stigma around AI than there was with Web3 and its heavy relation to crypto in particular, because that was fundamentally something that people just didn't trust. While AI sort of had this cool factor of, look at what I can do with this technology that's so readily available to me.
Yeah.
And I think also in many ways it was easier to adopt AI tools as part of a brand's product base than it was to onboard themselves into Web3. So, you could use a conventional API versus learning how to transact in crypto and learning what you would need to do on the blockchain front before you even, press the button go.
And, speaking of that, at the end of 2023, there was, some, you know, enthusiasm that fell off. But your experience and the people that I'm talking to, you're probably seeing dedicated builders, dedicated artists, people that are still creating content in this space. And it feels like that these are people that are still building, the bricks of the foundation of this as it goes forward and can adapt as it changes one way or another. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like to me as I kind of talk around people that are in it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, listen, these are the people who are going to be the most successful architects. Like, these are the ones that take an iterative approach to the spaces they are building in. Going back to your metaphor of trying to fly the plane as you build it at the same time, you cannot assume that you know exactly what it's supposed to look like before you've built it and started using it. You can't assume you know how to drive a car before you've worked out how you want to position the gears. And so I think, those that were best placed to adapt to changing circumstances and essentially remap their strategies accordingly to the shifts in the landscape were the ones that stuck around. The way I like to see it, I think I'm quite a visual thinker, and I always envision, people sailing against the wind. And, you can try switch that boat's engine on and you can try push against the elements. But if your sails are down, you're going to be forced in another direction, whether you like it or not. The others that sort of leaned into the current and adjusted their paths found a new way to navigate. And that meant that they didn't have this resistance or this frustration or this desire to abandon because things got difficult. I think it just meant that, okay, we're gonna pivot slightly. And it may not have been the original vision, but we're still here, we're still active, we're still moving, and that's still testament to our survival and our potential here, or our potential to build here. Because we have to remember, innovation thrives in the face of uncertainty, right? Like, all of the major progress happens when we realize that there's a need for us to change something. It was actually the reason why Glitchwire, the show, was born. The principle is we don't encounter glitches until something goes wrong, and it forces us to go back, realize what the bug was, and then change it. Either we can correct it if we know exactly what we're doing, or we can see what direction it led us towards and see if that's a path we still want to keep going down. So something as simple as the human mindset can really help us navigate and really help us succeed in very, very challenging and challenging areas with big unknowns.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I love that. That makes total sense. That's a great title for a show. And I mean, I started this too because I was never going to be a coder. I was never going to be a DApp developer. It's never going to happen. But I love the conversation and I knew how to create media and I was pretty good about connecting with people. And so selfishly, I get to learn a lot as I go forward and meet amazing people. And hopefully the byproduct of that is that, the three people that watch this show, have a fighting understanding of like really, what is all of this that they're talking about, So that's fantastic. That's really cool.
I mean, I fully have that with you in common. That's a large motivator as to why I'm in this space as well. I think having these conversations gives you a lot of privilege and insight into the way that the people who are fundamentally building this technology thinks. And you can sort of counter those perspectives with others that you've heard and really piece together this much bigger mosaic of what's happening. And I think that's invaluable knowledge. And I'm similar to you, like this, I'm not a coder, but I'd like to think that I have a good grasp of the concept behind these ideas. And if this is the arena where I can apply my skill set and engage and participate, then let it be that.
Yeah. Yeah. What you do is totally inspiring. So hats off. I mean, it's really pretty fantastic.
Thank you.
Blokhaus and marketers like yourselves that are on the cutting edge of this industry in this space, you mentioned a couple of things in your piece about emotional intelligence and, awareness and things like that. And when I hear that, it sounds obvious and important. But have you seen examples of why this is critical to, make sure people have their eye on that?
I think that's a great question. I think in terms of, this importance of emotional intelligence and like the impact that we can create on a very psychological level is because we're coming from an industry that is designed to communicate to people. We're not marketing to machines. We're marketing back to fellow people. And so I think there were a couple examples of how this technology, particularly AI, has been used to demonstrate how fundamental the role of people. A couple examples that I personally love was, at the end of last year, the Beatles released a new song. It was called Now and Then. And what they had done was they used AI to extract John Lennon's voice from a demo track that was from all the way from the 70s, restored it, and then layered it back onto clean instrumentals. Now, I know people who loved the song. I know people who hated the song and felt that the Beatles were best left in the decade that they originally produced this music in. But regardless what you felt about the music itself, it created this collective cultural moment. And it's very rare with the technology like AI that often makes people feel like the human sort of stripped out of the equation. And I can't remember who said it, but the metaphor that I loved was it gave us a moment where everyone could look at the sky and see the same stars. Suddenly, we were all on the exact same level, and we understood that what we were interacting with here. And so, it essentially poses the question of, without humans to consume this material, to interpret and to enjoy this creative output, what's the point? What else is it for? And that being said, another favorite example of mine is this company called Runway. So Runway is a generative AI video platform. And what they did to position themselves in the market, which I think was genius, was they hosted a film festival. And the only criteria were that the submissions included an AI-generated component to their work. And I happened to stumble across this when I was, doing my research. And the quality of the submissions was astounding. And, similar to my last example, like human taste and experience and emotional intelligence, that's what allowed us to determine what we loved from what we hated. And even if we hated it, that was a reaction too. But we didn't watch this content and coming out of it neutral. We were supposed to feel something. I think both of these cases demonstrate how this tech has the power to generate an emotional response, to make us feel a particular way. And I think you still need a human being at the helm of that's engineering how to elicit that response through human perspective, fundamentally human perspective. And so I think, again, that's a clear way to demonstrate how this sort of tech can actually create impact.
Okay, so let's close with this. I want to ask you about a quote that I saw in the piece, and it reads, "We human beings are naturally fascinated by tech. We often default to thinking that each innovation is a silver bullet, a solution to a whole industry's problems." So I'm going to ask you a very human question. How does that make you feel? And is it, so AI is not going to get us off the hook and save us from all evil?
That's a very existential question. I can probably answer it in one word, and it's the first word that popped into my mind. It's relief. I would really hate to think that the complexities of our lives could be distilled down and solved by a sophisticated piece of machinery. I would like to give us more credit than that, both as a civilization and as a planet. I think that sometimes we really get caught up in super dogmatic thinking. And I think that was evidenced by things like, the EACC movement, effective accelerationism. And we think that everything can be solved by tech. And with that assumption, we completely dismiss practices that have worked for us from centuries. So I'm talking about ancient practices that still provide a lot of relevance to today. Something like regenerative agriculture. You know, like we've got all of this innovation about stem cell meat production and vertical farming, and like regenerative agriculture could go a huge way into effectively reducing the impact of climate change. A very simple solution that is age old. So while I think, yes, tech can provide the world with a lot of solutions, it can also create just as many problems if we are not careful. And I think people need to remember that technological progress is fundamentally neutral until we as humans put our hands on it and then we use it in a particular way. So I think this is sort of where, I guess, to use holistic terms, mindfulness and intent behind what we're building, why we're building it, and how we define progress really, really does matter. So, you know, I'd argue that generating billions of dollars in profit can sound like progress to some. But unless we're going to alleviate really pressing matters, you know, climate change, wealth inequality, food security, the progress is only going to be finite, and it's only going to be felt by a select few. So again, you know, the answer to this sort of question, I think, is something that motivated the creation of Glitchwire. You know, we're speaking to the people who are building this tech, and then in those conversations, we have this opportunity to ask ourselves, you know, is this the future we really want? And if it's not, that's okay, but what needs to change so we adjust our course? And to not let us, you know, going back to this ocean metaphor of being caught away and taken with the tide, how do we adapt our own sails to make sure that we're all going in the same path and we're all collectively pursuing the same collective good?
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. This has been just a blast, and I look forward to, you know, diving into more of your content. And I'm just truly grateful for everything.
Thank you so much for having me, Vince. I do have to say it's very different being on the receiving end of the interview questions for a change. And I'm getting a sense of what my guests now must feel. So this was a very illuminating experience, but I'm very glad that you were the one steering that ship.
Yeah. Well, anytime. So, amazing. And, so I'm wishing you well, and, I'm sure we'll bump into each other at some event or conference or something like that. So, I look forward to that, and, have a great weekend.
Thanks again.